Hey, and welcome to Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am your host. It is great to be with you here today. Hey, I wanted to remind you about the Patreon link in my show notes. You should sign up there. I'm going to have some exclusive content that's Patreon member only coming your way. I'm going to be talking about different things going on in American evangelicalism that might be a little bit more spicy, maybe some hot takes, but hopefully it'll be godly and biblical first and foremost. So sign up there. I'm going to be talking about Matt Chandler and the Village and other stuff like that. So you're not going to want to miss it. So make sure you sign up in the show notes at my Patreon. Today, I have the privilege of connecting with somebody I connected with originally over in Oxford this summer named Robert Brewis. Robert, thanks so much for joining me on the show today.
Hi, thank you, Chase. It's a great privilege to be here, and I look forward to our conversation.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things we talked about in a pub in London or in Oxford, and what I loved about Robert was how animated he was and how passionate he was about the truth of God's word. I guess for my listeners, Robert, I want to hear a bit of your story just so we can get that out there. So you're currently a minister in the Anglican Church, and you're doing your PhD. Is that a summary of what you're doing?
Yeah, that's right. I'm a minister, and in the Anglican Church, that means I've got a license to a particular local church. So I'm licensed to St Mary's Horton Green, where I work with a colleague of mine, Mark Galoo, who's the senior minister there, and we have some other people on staff. And while I'm there, I'm also working on my PhD, which hopefully I'm coming to the conclusion of, which is looking at Reformed theology within an Anglican minister, a man who was called Handley Moule, important in things like the Keswick movement, which people in America have probably heard of because of Schaefferian theology, but actually that wasn't where he was coming from. So I'm looking at his understanding of Christian doctrine and the Christian life.
I love it. Yeah, the Keswick movement, once I discovered it a few years ago in terms of a historical thing, and I came across it and I saw a lot of dots connecting there in terms of higher life spirituality and how it's kind of shaped a lot of ministries and approaches to ministry. So I really appreciated your presentation on that. And I look forward to seeing the dissertation you write, because I, for one, will be interested in reading it. One thing I wanted to talk about right off the top, though, you're over in England, and as of now, we're recording this. This episode will come out a couple weeks, but we're recording. And yesterday, the Queen has passed, and so as an American, we can fail to realize the seriousness of that. What has that been like for you? What has that been like that you've seen on the ground over there?
On the ground over here, people see it as a major watershed. The Queen is obviously the most prominent figure in public life in our nation. She doesn't change like with the frequency of a president. She has been on the throne since Winston Churchill was prime minister. I think that gives you a good sense of a historic continuity there.
Right.
And suddenly she's died. I suppose it was expected. She was very old, very frail. But for lots of people, she's been someone who has had a calm and reasoned voice at key times. Every Christmas, if you're an English person, you at least know of and more likely hear or watch the Queen give a speech about the national life, about her take on the events of the past year. So she's a constant presence. She's a constant focus in our media. So the royals will have, they'll be regularly spoken about, analysed, critiqued in the national press. I think for me personally, and for maybe other evangelical Christians as well, it is a significant moment because we feel that we have lost maybe sometimes the only Christian voice in a major public figure. And obviously that does touch on what we want to talk about later in Anglicanism, because actually for evangelicals, she's been clearer on the faith in the Archbishop, and at least several previous archbishops. Obviously I can't go back for a whole lifetime, that's loads of archbishops, but certainly in recent times, she's been more definite on Christ as Saviour and as King. So that feels like something sad, especially with Charles, for much of his early life, saying he wanted to be the defender of faith rather than the Reformed faith, which obviously a completely different definition of faith there.
Right. Yeah.
And the fact that he doesn't have any kind of real Christianity about him makes things very different, I think, in terms of what we expect from future speeches and things like that.
Yeah. So do you have a couple of examples that come to mind when you mentioned she's been more either vocal or a more consistent evangelical Protestant defender of the faith more than the Archbishop? Can you think of a couple of examples where maybe she's said something or done something to either lead that way?
Frequently, it would be in her Christmas speeches. Often at Christmas, she makes a speech, but she uses it to talk about what inspires her or her fundamental beliefs as well. And she's been very clear, sometimes quoting from the hymns of John Wesley. Sometimes she has spoken about Christ being her inspiration. But one of the most recent ones, in fact, I think it's the only time she may have gone in print to give a forward to a book, was when she spoke about the fact that God did not send a general or a philosopher into the world, but a savior, because we need rescuing, which, it wasn't exactly the most full-blooded statement about sin and wrath, but it was better than we've often heard, from the Archbishop, quite frankly, when often it's a message of socialism wrapped up in Christian dress.
Wow. Okay. That's very interesting. Yeah. So I guess if we could, I'd love to segue to the kind of that topic where, someone like me, I grew up Southern Baptist, now non-denominational pastor. The landscape in Anglicanism is it's quite literally foreign to me, but it feels that way also. And so I want to understand the head of state, or the Queen was, now the King. Are they the head of the church as well over there?
I think it's worth understanding what that means.
Okay,
so when
great.
we talk about being head of the church, within the 39 Articles of Faith, which is the official doctrinal position of the Church of England, they have no right over the word of God or the administration of the sacraments.
Okay.
So they're not head like the Pope is.
Okay.
What they are, and this goes back to the times in many ways before a constitutional monarchy, they are the head in the sense that they, as head of the whole territory, were therefore head of everything, including the church. Okay. The idea historically was that they should therefore take the lead in defending the Protestant and Reformed religion, which is actually what the Queen's vow was at her coronation. That'll be interesting to see what it means for Charles to make that same vow.
Right.
Because it is explicitly the Protestant and Reformed, not Anglo-Catholic, not Liberal Catholic.
Right.
Or anything like that. So their headship isn't that they have charge over ministers, they're not a sort of second archbishop or something like that. It's because the nation, it's because of the history of the nation being a monarchy, and therefore all people being under the king or queen.
Okay. So in terms of the Anglican Church, she doesn't have authority as far as word or sacrament, but there is a sense of duty that she, or now he, possesses to defend the Protestant religion. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and I suppose that we are his ministers for the sake of the true religion in his land, would be how historically it would have been understood. So when I became a minister, I had to swear my oath of allegiance to the head of state.
Fascinating. Okay. Man, that's so un-American. It's amazing.
It's not a republic.
Yeah. So you've got, okay, so then in the Church of England, and maybe this is where we can talk about you a little bit more personally, did you grow up in the Anglican Church? Was this something that, becoming a minister, you always wanted to become a minister, or what did that look like for you?
I grew up outside of the Church of England, as my parents were Christian. I grew up a Presbyterian. in a small Reformed Presbyterian denomination in this country, but I attended the Church of England as well. So my friends went to the Church of England. To have Christian peers at school was the Church of England. As I grew up, I did want to be a Christian minister. I felt called to it from my teenage years, even though it was something I suppressed for a long time, preferring to be a professional sportsman or something along those lines. But the Church of England is so part of our national life that my mum grew up an Anglican. My dad didn't. My dad grew up a Methodist, but very closely related to the Anglican Church in this country. And knowing the vicar would be part of his life growing up. Why I mentioned my mum was because in some ways my call to ministry came through my mother, and I remember her saying to me, "What do you want to do when you grow up?" I said, "I want to be a soccer player," as you would call it.
Sure.
And my mum sort of said, "Well, why don't you be a vicar?" And something sort of hit me in the stomach. What was interesting was, even though she was a Presbyterian, she used the word vicar.
Yeah, right.
Which just tells you something about the deep Anglicanism in our country.
Yeah.
But we often still think like that. You know, we talk about the minister because that's a universal term. So yeah, that was how I came to ministry. The 39 articles, I suppose, gave me a little bit more flexibility than the Westminster Confession of Faith, in that whilst I felt I could still sign up to 98% of the confession, when I was going through for ministry, the men I spoke to didn't seem to reflect maybe a kind of flexibility on subscription that you might have in the PCA in the USA. So not being able to sign up 100% and still wanting to work things out on questions like Sabbath and things like that, I found myself naturally able to find kinship and theological agreement with Reformed friends in the Anglican Church. And that's why I ended up being an Anglican minister.
That's great. And when you become an Anglican minister, is there a seminary or a college you're required to attend in order to become and be ordained as a priest or a vicar?
Well, historically, the answer is yes. Now, sadly, these things have become a lot more looser, but essentially it's still yes. You do get choice over where you go. So for me, that was going to Oak Hill Theological College in North London.
Okay.
For me, that was a great place to be. I really enjoyed it. It was brilliant teaching by great men, particularly the late Principal Mike Ovey, who used to write in Themelios, the journal. He was a great man, a great teacher of doctrine. And so that was a real privilege to go there. And then once completing that, we become a priest or presbyter. Not, again, that's a very English thing. The word priest shouldn't be mistaken for a Catholicizing understanding, whilst people want to give it that. Again, historically, it was related to the word presbyter. It was actually the English word for presbyter, bizarrely. So It's actually the other way around. Not that the switch actually goes from presbyter to say, what's the English word for presbyteros, or it's priest. And then because it gets Catholicized, so we go back to presbyter.
That's funny.
It's a sort of brief history. Yeah.
So as an Anglican,
go on. So it actually means that originally the English term priest did not mean Old Testament sacrificer. The English word priest was that guy down the street who's teaching the Bible back in the sort of medieval and ancient times.
That makes sense. And so you go to Oak Hill and you matriculate there, and then do you go through an ordination process, or what does that look like?
So Oak Hill's the first half of the ordination process. You have to get signed off by your college. And then the second half is when you do a QC, and that is when you go out into the first 3 years of ministry. You have to basically go through this process of 3 years of ministry under a senior minister, and him, along with the bishop and the diocese, then sign you off as a fully licensed minister within your time as a curate.
Okay.
And then you can then go out to be a senior minister somewhere, but you are then fully ordained as a priest or presbyter in the Church of England.
Okay. And then once you become that, do you, as a priest or presbyter, do you like go apply at different parishes or churches, or are they appointing you at different places? How does that work?
No, it's a simple, straightforward application system. So we're not sent anywhere.
Okay.
It's you look for job adverts, you apply, the parish will appoint you, but it's normally a few bodies appointing. So it's not just, does the local congregation want you? It's the local congregation through its representatives, plus often the bishop, plus what's called parish reps. Sorry, not parish reps, that's people representing the congregation. Plus outside bodies. Now, this is where it'd be most confusing for an American, in that we have what's called patrons. In the English system, again, this is semi-feudal, goes back to who owns the parish, who owns the land. Essentially, someone's bought the parish back in, could be in, medieval times or since. Charles Simeon, for example, the well-known evangelical minister, he bought lots of appointments, so he could appoint the vicar to various parishes. So it was a patronage body called the Simeon Trust. Now, there's lots of these bodies. Often they are Oxford or Cambridge colleges, because Oxford and Cambridge originally were universities for the training of the clergy.
Right.
And so you have a patron, the parish reps who represent the congregation, and then the bishop coming together to make the appointment is normally how it works.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, like there's a beauty in it where there's connections to history, there's connections to the greater church. In American, Baptist life, it's like you have a different kind of pipeline where you become a youth pastor for 5 to 10 years. And then one day maybe you can become a senior pastor, but it's so disconnected, so independent. It's a bit nauseating, honestly. When I think about Anglicanism, I've got friends over here that are Anglican ministers, Anglican priests. This is a big question, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but I do want to at least touch on it. When the Anglican Church in England, is there a connection to the Anglican Church in America, or is there no connection?
I think you have, it's how do we talk about those connections? So there's obviously connection historically in that Anglican bishops originally went out, Anglican ministers went out and evangelized in America. And then you had the formation of the Episcopal Church, which then became a distinct Anglican body, so that the link then is only one which is historic and originally would have been doctrinal, as well as a link to the Archbishop of Canterbury, not as the head of the Episcopal Church, but recognizing Canterbury as the historic see, as it were, from which Anglicanism moved out.
Okay.
Obviously, now you have the ANCA as well, where the link is not within the structures, as it were, around the Archbishop of Canterbury, but a doctrinal link to those who would want to stand on documents like the Jerusalem Declaration, which was formed in 2011, if I remember rightly. So the links are historic, sometimes vague. Again, they break down in practice, in that within the Anglican Church now, where I am, there'd be groups of us who would want very little to do with the TEC, seeing them as largely apostate, and there'd be others within the Church of England who'd love to have a relationship with the TEC and just think how marvelous, and things like that. So the links are variegated and complex, if I'm honest.
Yeah, I sense that. So that kind of brings us to some of the stuff I wanted to talk about regarding, the movements within the Anglican Church, because as an outsider, it's easy to look at it and go like, dude, there's some crazy stuff going on there. And, how do you all get along? I talk with a pastor friend regularly, and he's of the mindset where it's like he could become an Anglican easily because it is so broad. And so, But my attitude is like, well, how could you have fellowship? How could you have unity with such divergent theological convictions? Obviously, I would view the kind of more liberal theological convictions as almost apostate, and so it's very confusing. And so, what is that like for you, being trained at Oak Hill? Do you? I know the words over there are a little bit different. Do you use the word conservative theologically to describe where you are, or what? How would you describe yourself in that?
So I'd describe myself as a conservative Evangelical Anglican. I'd happily describe myself as a Reformed Anglican, looking back to Cranmer and Ridley and the Anglican Reformers. I could also describe myself as a 39 Articles and Prayer Book Anglican, saying I agree with the theology of those documents.
Hmm.
In terms of relationships within the Church of England and the global Anglican Church, it is disparate. There is actually often, sadly, little disagreement, and we are at odds with each other. So it's not the case of saying, well, actually, we're all essentially friends, we're all on the same page here. There is that feeling that people have departed from the faith and need to repent. Within the Church of England itself, that is just something that becomes more and more problematic by the day.
Right.
I think that we're often held together by history and by the fact the documents of the church are still orthodox. Now that then, some people would say, oh, that, you're essentially a paper church. That was right. Martyn-Lloyd Jones's classic statement, because we're only held together by the documents rather than a kind of living bond of we all kind of recognize each other as being completely, kosher, to use a word. And in some ways, yes, that's true. We are joined together by our documents more than by our actual practice and life. We are finding ourselves, calling each other to repent, saying, actually, I don't like this. This needs to stop. And so it's not as if everyone's kind of just holding theology as taste. No, I think we are heading more and more for some kind of division. The question is how that's worked out in the way that divisions have been worked out within America and other parts of the Anglican communion worldwide.
Yeah, and this kind of gets back to my research on Puritanism and the separatists and non-separatists, and this has been going on, and it was on different matters, but it's been going on for a long time. And so I'm curious today, when you think about your interaction, I hear these relationships with bishops and patrons and the people of the church and all that kind of thing. It would seem if you get in a certain region, which is controlled by more liberal priest and bishop and all that, it would be hard to get a job even. Is that a common experience for people maybe like yourself who would align more conservative?
Yes, I think it's an experience for some people. It does depend on the diocesan bishop and how things work. Friends do sometimes find themselves cut out of some jobs and pushed into others. So I can think of a friend. He was cut out of one parish he applied for because he'd be complementarian, as I would be. But then he was pushed into another role because maybe they felt that was going to be less successful, or maybe would keep him quieter,
Sure.
that sort of thing. Some dioceses, the bishop, at least it's said unofficially, and you don't know how this necessarily all works out in practice. It might be said that he won't accept, he or sadly, she now won't accept a complementarian into the diocese. That's not always true. At the same time, we are meant to have mutual flourishing, which is a statement from Archbishop Welby. Of course, mutual flourishing, I can see that working from his perspective. It's hard for that to work when you have a perspective actually there's right and wrong in the world. But it does mean, at least in practice, for something to appeal to for those of us who still say we are holding to the official position of the Church of England in its historic doctrine and formulas. I think that's what keeps a lot of people in that for lots of people, I at least hope there's a red line which is when the doctrine is lost. But, I think as well, a friend of mine put it like this, the Church of England is like a couple that's been throwing plates at each other for years. And at some point, are we going to sit down and say we can keep throwing plates at each other for the next 30 years, or we can have a divorce where we both sort of get what we want? And how that divorce is worked out may be one of the big questions for England in the years to come.
Yes.
The issue is quite simply, because we're a territorial church and an established church, that weighs on the consciences of people, that some will say, well, we don't want to hand over the church to become a national cult. If we can continue to fight for truth, we might do that. Others will say, look, game's up. We need to just actually start something else and accept that Jesus will rule his church, and we need to keep doing evangelism and be faithful and see what happens and let the established church die.
Wow.
It's that kind of discussion, I think, at the minute.
Wow. And so when you think about reforming, there's a lot of, at least in American evangelicalism, there's a lot of hunger amongst certain kind of conservative, reformed Christians to see renewal, to see gospel renewal, to see flourishing in the church and in the nation. And a lot of people are wondering, where can we do that? Where's our place? So, of course, the American temperament is, we'll just start a new organization, we'll start a new church. And there's something to that, that entrepreneurial spirit, but that can too easily dismiss tradition sometimes as well. But I guess within your situation, the church over there, what would it look like to reform, or how do you stop it from becoming more liberalized? Is there even a way to make sure that, hey, we're not letting it go any further? Like, how does that work?
And that's a very good question. And in some ways, it's gone too far all over the place, sadly. But I think, to give the present example, what we have at the minute is 3 houses of synod: House of Bishops, House of Clergy, House of Laity. They make decisions on behalf of the Church of England should there be a change in doctrine.
Okay.
Right now, the big discussion is over homosexuality and the blessing of same-sex relationships. That cannot become official in the Church of England as something legally acceptable unless each house gives a majority yes to it.
Okay, is it like 51%? Is that a majority?
No, I can't remember quite now, but I think it's higher than that. And they have two-thirds majority in each house. Now, however, the problem is, on the ground, you have bishops breaking that rule. So the great problem in the Church of England is, what do you do when the police don't keep the law?
Sure.
That kind of issue.
Yeah.
However, still, it does mean that in terms of official legality, you have orthodoxy, holds the position. If all 3 houses do not vote yes, for example, to a change, that's what I meant by will continue to throw plates at each other, where the Liberals will hold much of the power, but a more conservative laity will continue to be in the House of Laity, sadly not the House of Clergy or Bishops, will continue to block this. Now, if that is possible to maintain the blocking by the laity, then the question becomes, can we establish, for example, a 3rd province? So you have York as a province with the Northern Diocese within it. You have Canterbury as a province. Should we start a 3rd province, or could we start a 3rd diocese where churches will be able to start to move to that? I don't know how that would all work legally, but what it means is you'd still then have an established church, but it would be distinct with visible differentiation between itself and the other churches in the Church of England. Everyone would know, or you're in the diocese of whatever, that's because you are orthodox on sexuality, or or a bigot, depending on what we want to call me.
Now, as a diocese region, is it geographic, like a certain region? So how many dioceses in England are there?
That is a good question. Off the top of my head, I can't remember it's 40 something, I think.
Oh, okay. So it's not just like two. So you're
No,
saying that
no.
the Diocese of York could be a new diocese, which would be more conservative. Is that what you're saying?
No, I think what would be actually establishing a new diocese by
Oh,
resurrecting an old one, most
gotcha.
likely. That was the way to go.
Okay.
Now, obviously, in America, they've done it by starting a new Anglican institution.
Yeah.
That option is already on the table for Anglicans here. So we have something called the AMIE, the Anglican Mission in England,
Oh,
which is formally tied to the ANCA at the kind of level of the episcopate, in that bishops are in fellowship with bishops between the two.
fascinating. Okay. And then just real briefly, because I know we're running out of time, I got to ask, where does N.T. Wright fall in all of this? I have a lot of friends that are big fans of his. I mean, he's a huge impact. Resurrection of the Son of God. From what I hear, it's legendary. It's a bit of an insurmountable read for me at this time. And so, so where does he land in all of this?
Right, I think, from what I've last heard, lacks the sort of clarity I would like on the homosexual issue.
Sure.
He's gone from being a bishop of Durham to back to being an academic at St Andrews University in Scotland, I believe.
Okay.
So I know Wright's influential in America. He doesn't speak out particularly over here. He's a hidden voice entirely. And Wright has caused a lot of problems for conservative evangelicals in this country, both in his rejection, it would seem, of penal substitution and the imputation of Christ's righteousness.
Yeah, it's tough. And I mean, over here, he's just such a big figure. But yeah, I always forget, over here, we treat these people as kind of like a celebrity. And over there, he's just kind of one of many, and he's a part of a whole. And then I guess the last question I want to ask before we run out of time is, what is it that is, in your perspective, has it been kind of the intellectualizing of the faith, rationalization of the faith over the last 100 years? How did you said the clergy and the bishops were less likely to be conservative than the laity, if you've got kind of those three groups? How do you perceive that to have happened, without going into too much history, but how do you perceive that to have happened?
I mean, the great change for, I guess, all of us in the Western world is that term from the faith being one of biblical revelation from God to it being the overflow of the human consciousness and the human sense of God. So therefore, all doctrine just becomes what did people think about God? And so the New Testament just becomes, well, this was the feeling of the first eyewitnesses. That's why it's so important. It's their emotional response to it. That has run through English theology, especially with a theology called Lux Mundi, which came out of F.D. Morris, a man called Charles Gore, and shaped then the 20th century theology, running into different movements. But essentially, that's what you've got. So you've got the loss of biblical revelation. Then you've got the resurgence of evangelicalism in the 20th century, especially in Anglicans with John Stott, J.I. Packer, Dick Lucas, and Oak Hill College, movements that have come out from there and seen lots of men go into ministry and congregations grow. Now, there's also the charismatic movement, I should say, which has also produced relatively conservative people on sexuality at times. And so I think these two things have led to numbers on the ground reflecting lay people who are fairly conservative on the issue of sexuality, for example, clergy who are not, but also most lay people can't understand the theology that's coming out of liberal schools. And so they probably move slower, even though now, of course, the zeitgeist has completely shifted. Right. So that, you go to school, it's Pride Month, all the young people are being indoctrinated.
Yes. Yeah. Man, that's a challenging situation. And it'll be interesting to see how it plays out with Charles. I did see that yesterday, like you mentioned, kind of defender of faith rather than of the Protestant Reformed faith. And one of the things with Elizabeth, because you want to, she just passed, and so it'll be interesting to see what her legacy is. And, so as an American, I was always like, I had heard, she's Protestant, perhaps even evangelical. What would it look like for her to have spoken more, to help that. But, I also don't know what it's like to be in a position of royalty over that. So I know there's a lot of pressures that come with that. But it'll be interesting to see how it plays out over there. And I think our American listeners need to be in prayer for the church over there, because there's big things happening. Is there anything, any way that people can keep up with you? I know that you're not very active necessarily on social media, but you've got a dissertation coming. Any books, sermons, anything like that we can promote to get kind of resources in people's hands?
By me or other people around, you mean? Sorry.
Mainly you. Yeah.
Yeah, well, my sermons do go on to St Mary's, Horton Green. That's a church I'm with my friend Mark. We're seeking to renew. It was a sort of left-leaning, wet, charismatic church, if I'm honest, but we're trying to move that in a evangelical direction. So sermons on there. I am an editor for the Journal Churchman, which is now called the Global Anglican, I should say, which looks to resource the whole Anglican communion with Reformed theology. So do be on the lookout for that journal. It's normally stocked in most seminary libraries. Gerald Bray was a former editor who might be known to some listeners, as Peter Jensen, former Archbishop of Sydney.
Okay.
Principal of Moore College is now the editor. So good material in there.
That's great. Well, thanks so much for joining me and taking time to share all this. I know these may seem like basic questions to you, but to me, these are like very helpful to understand what's going on. So thanks so much for spending time with me.
No, you're welcome. Thank you.
All right. If you're a listener and you enjoyed this episode, I'd love for you to give it a great rating. Just give it 5 stars. It's easy to click those 5 stars down there. Subscribe to the channel. Make sure you can stay up to date. Share this with a friend. If you've got a friend that's flirting with Anglicanism, this will be a great coffee conversation for them and you to talk about challenges, Reformation, those kind of things. And as I said in the episode, do be in prayer for the Church of England and for people like Robert who are doing great gospel work over there. So next time we'll have, well, I don't know who we'll have. I'm still lining up guests, but you can look forward to some great content coming your way. We'll see you soon.